I'd say kind of the third area that we're actually getting more and more into is just truly custom e-commerce, where their business model is not a standard, like we're going to buy a widget and ship it to your house. So we're kind of expanding the idea of e-commerce a little more broadly and building solutions that don't fit on any e-commerce framework.
Scott, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. How about you?
Not too bad, not too bad. It's a little cloudy, a little overcast today. So the weather's been like a lot nicer than usual. Well, it's a lot warmer. Like last year around like Halloween, it was just like freezing. It was like 30 degrees.
Right.
So I'm kind of riding this wave out as
It
long as we
was
can.
it was 70 up here. Actually, it was almost 80 over the weekend here in New Jersey, which is just you don't get that in
Right,
November. So
right.
we went out and took a good walk outside.
Nice, nice. Yeah, it seems like that's. I have a buddy in Michigan. It was like warmer than usual. So I guess it's like
Mhm.
the whole country. So how's everything going during COVID? What are you doing to stay sane? Hopefully you are staying sane.
Yeah,
How's it going
yeah.
for you?
Thankfully, we've been doing pretty well. Kind of hunkered down into our little island here. Um, Thankfully, more recently things opened back up. So I think they're going to close back down again. So we're
Right.
able to carefully, step out. But personally, it hasn't been too bad for us. I know a lot of people have been affected pretty badly, but thankfully,
Hmm.
at least for my family and for our company, it's not been too bad.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good, man. And have you worked remotely? Do you work remotely, or have you worked remotely for a while?
Yeah. Yeah. So we were actually, before COVID hit, we were putting together a plan to start going remote.
Hmm.
Um, we had, because we had actually a really strong in office culture for a long time, and had made our first foray into hiring remotely, I think, uh, almost about a year ago. So it was like September of 2019. And it didn't work out that well. I think we just didn't have the processes in place to support it. And
Hmm.
it was only a contract, like temporary contract. So it wasn't, a huge issue.
Hmm.
But like, it was actually someone who she did great work, and we would have liked to bring her on permanently. But she kind of said no to us, and I think it was partially because we didn't really support her very well, and so it wasn't like a very
Right.
good relationship. So we took a step back from that and said, okay, let's actually get some processes in place that would let us do remote work well.
Hmm.
Um, and originally it was going to be kind of a hybrid model, but then COVID hit, and it was just accelerated all of our plans. But what we did then is we have now officially said, okay, we're going to go remote permanently,
Hmm.
and we actually left our lease at our office and
Oh, wow.
are now officially fully remote, even when everything's would open back up fully.
Yeah, man. I think a lot of companies are going through that transition.
Mhm.
What are some of the and I think everybody goes through that transition where you kind of try it, but it's not fully baked and it's kind of awkward and stuff like that. What are some of the things you're thinking about, or processes you're trying to get into place to make it work?
Yeah, so the issues that we ran into in the first place were more around um, communication and culture. Just I think that this freelancer contractor we had hired, she felt disconnected. She didn't feel like part of the team. We kind of pushed a project over to her, and I would check in with Slack. And that was probably on me personally. I wasn't communicating with her as much as I could have, but again, the culture for the whole company was revolved around the office. We could see each other around and check
Hmm.
in with each other there. A lot of informal check-ins,
Hmm.
and so she didn't have that. So part of our vision initially, before COVID, that we were trying to fix was, how do we incorporate remote people almost into the office? Like, how do we bring that culture into the office, or push everything even in the office remote, so that there's kind of
Hmm.
a level playing field. Thankfully, once everyone did go remote, that kind of forced some of that issue. I mean, there's definitely still a cultural thing you've got to deal with. I'd say the bigger challenges once we really did go remote were all the logistical things.
Hmm.
We had a health insurance plan that only supported people in New Jersey. So if
Hmm.
you actually wanted to hire remotely, now we've got to change
Health
our health
insurance, man.
insurance.
Health
Like we
insurance.
have we had an IT provider who like did like just help desk type support, who was really only set up for doing local help
Right.
desk stuff. So we had to figure out how to do IT support remotely. So it's
Right.
just those little logistical stuff that we had to
What
sort.
did you do with healthcare? I know healthcare is complicated. A lot of people struggle with it. Was there a provider that you found that was just great, like across
Yeah,
the
so
US?
we already were using Paychex for just handling our paycheck processing, um, uh, but our health insurance plan was purchased directly by our company. What
Mhm.
we did was we did go ahead and switch to Paychex's PEO program, and because their PEO program is national, their healthcare plan is also national. So
Mhm.
then we were able to, offer it through that PEO.
Mhm. Nice. And then like as far as other stuff, like where like what tools are you using? Slack? Are you relying more heavily on like writing stuff down in Jira, ticketing, that kind of stuff? Like what type of stuff are y'all doing?
Yeah, we've had a reasonably strong, I wouldn't say super strong, but a reasonably strong culture of writing things down in the first place. So
Mhm.
that helped us. We didn't really have to transition a whole lot there. Um, but we were already using Slack, but obviously one of the big differences was the development team used Slack very regularly. But we were
Mhm.
and technically it was rolled out to the whole company, but a lot of other teams, especially our creative team, they love talking to each other in person.
Mhm.
So there's kind of like this silo of development from the whole rest of the company. But with going remote, now Slack is where everybody lives, and so there's just a lot more volume going through there. Um,
Right. Right.
Slack definitely has its downsides as far as kind of effect on communication, but for the most part, it's worked pretty well for us.
Right, right. The universal Slack notification sound just popping up all over the all day
Yeah,
long and stuff like that.
yeah.
Um,
One of the things, I mean, I personally do, and this isn't a company thing, but I actually turn off those notifications because actually I haven't gone as far as you. I think you like schedule out your day like crazy, like like we were just on Twitter DMs last night, and you said, "Oh, I check my email in the morning." And I remember on Twitter when you were first talking about kind of putting that in place. I don't go that far, but I
yeah,
was like partially inspired by that. I kind of was already doing it, but I went further this direction. Basically, like
nice.
all notifications turned off everywhere. I still check it a lot more frequently, I think, than probably you do,
Right.
Slack or email,
Baby
but at
steps.
least it's not popping up in my face,
Yeah.
distracting me when I'm trying to work on something else.
Yeah.
So that's a
Have
big help.
it's interesting, like you mentioned it's not like a company policy necessarily. Like that's one of the things I think about is like, how do you roll those things out across the company where it's like you want to tell people like, hey, protect your time, try not
Mhm.
to get so distracted by all the notifications, but at the same time, it might not necessarily be an official company policy of turning your notifications off.
Yeah, so one thing that we've been playing with, we haven't actually done this yet. So, hi anybody from like the team who's actually going to listen to this. But we've actually thought about putting,
Surprise.
yeah, we've thought about putting together, and this is like sounds way more rigid than it would actually be, like almost an SLA by communication method, just as
Right.
a guideline for expectation. If someone texts you, like that's like a P1, and so the only
Yeah.
way I would contact someone on my team like off hours if I needed like P1 emergency, like major client sites down or something, is I'm going
Mm,
to text them personally,
yeah.
because I'm not expecting them to look at Slack off hours, um, and uh, and so like and then it's like Slack is probably like one level down from that, and email, and just kind of set an expectation that way of saying, email, if you get back to me that same day or the next day, that's
Mhm,
fine. No need to respond immediately to that. Slack,
mhm,
I don't know what it is, but maybe within an hour or two, just kind of setting some expectations there, I think will be helpful. Um, we That was actually part of our initial plan when we went remote to roll that out, but there was just so much to do, we didn't actually get
mhm.
that out yet.
Nice,
But
yeah. I
we'll try
love
it
that
out and
idea,
let you
like
know.
yeah, I love that idea, like SLAs by communication channel, because it's like for
Mhm.
some people, email is immediate, it's like respond within minutes. I think there's a general expectation that it's like you said, a day or so-ish,
Mhm.
whereas other channels, I think you wanna, get to them more quickly. So the company you work for is Ripen Digital, and,
There's no digital.
so
It's just Ripen.
oh,
But yes,
Ripen,
I mean,
sorry.
we do digital
Uh,
stuff though, so
you
it's
do
not wrong.
digital.
Yeah.
So what do you guys kind of specialize in? I know you're obviously in the e-commerce space and stuff like that, but what do you guys specialize in? What makes you guys unique?
Yeah. So we were very generalist for a long time, and we still are generalist in the sense that we would take on e-commerce projects of pretty much any shape or size. We really don't try to stay as much as possible from anything that's not truly e-commerce related.
Mhm.
But I would say kind of over the last couple of years, like three main areas have evolved as particular strength areas for us. One of those is really content led design. So we have a full content studio in house, the video studio and photography studio. We can do
Oh,
some
really?
really high end content work there. So
Oh,
when
that's
it
cool.
comes to like D2C brands that want to have a really content led approach to their site. In those cases, the dev team almost, we still are involved, but we almost recede into the background, and it's really our designers working with page builders, but doing a really like heavy content driven approach.
Mhm.
Um, Kind of on the far opposite side of the spectrum are kind of our other two strengths that are much more engineering led. One is we've built a in-house product that connects Magento with Profit 21, which is an Epicor ERP, and we've been rolling that out to a number of clients now. It's an interesting space because the Profit 21 ERP is specifically sold to distributors and wholesalers, or not exclusively, but largely. So a lot
Mhm.
of these businesses are doing dual B2B and B2C channels simultaneously. So they
Mm.
need to straddle the line of both of those sets of functionality. So that's been an interesting challenge to work on.
Mhm.
Um, I'd say kind of the third area that we're actually getting more and more into is just truly custom e-commerce, where their business model is not a standard, like we're going to buy a widget and ship it to your house. So we're kind of expanding the idea of e-commerce a little more broadly and building solutions that don't fit on any e-commerce framework. So we work with one company that's like a medical alerts company that sells like service like dependents for seniors. And so like the whole
Mhm.
purchasing process for that one's a little bit more standard, but still there's like a subscription plan, like a SaaS plan that goes behind that. Um,
Mm.
Working
Mhm.
with a telehealth company right now to kind of build the whole like front end purchasing process for doctors' practices to purchase a telehealth product.
Mhm.
So we've kind of some interesting projects along those lines as well.
That's interesting, man. You're hitting like all of the like so many of the important trends right now, like B2B, like content driven stuff, experiential stuff, and then
Mhm.
like it sounds like headless maybe or like, e-commerce that's just super custom, which I'd say are like three of the strongest trends in
Yeah.
e-commerce right now. So that's pretty
we
interesting.
we we've explored headless. We've actually we haven't actually launched a headless e-commerce site yet. We've launched a number of headless sites that are. I say we stick to e-commerce. We'll occasionally take on a content site if it kind of comes along with a client who's we're doing e-commerce for them, but they want to do their corporate site too.
Hmm.
We've launched a couple with like a cloud CMS and then like a static site build that builds off of that in like a headless sense
Hmm.
for either live API driven or like a static site build for content sites. Uh, I was really in favor of like the headless approach for e-commerce for a while. I still think it holds a lot of potential,
Hmm.
but I backed off a little bit from it, just feeling like it's really not mature enough for
Hmm.
a lot of customers of ours to use. So
Yeah.
when we talk about custom, it's often full custom, head to tail. So it's using serverless models and microservices. So there's no one like monolith platform, but it's fully custom. There's no like headless still backend platform that we're talking to.
Gotcha. So you're just using like a payment processor like Stripe or something like that, and then you're just building out like custom code and
Right,
stuff like
exactly.
that. Yeah,
Right,
yeah,
right.
that's cool. What are you more like what are you enjoying the most? What are you the most excited about as far as the different like projects you're working on?
Yeah, I think I mean that third category is particularly interesting to me because it's kind of a new territory. I mean, just again, personally speaking, e-commerce a lot of times feel like it's like you're reinventing the wheel because like oh get about another product page. It's it looks at least 10% different than the last one we built.
Yeah.
And of course, that 10% difference means that you can't like use you can reuse some code, and we do reuse code, but like there's that 10% difference still requires you to rebuild
Do
a
a
whole
lot of
ton of
stuff.
stuff,
Yeah.
but you're not really accomplishing anything new. So I
Right.
think like that third category is really exciting because you get to work on it's still a purchase process, but you're building something that's really unique to that business's needs rather
Hmm.
than just another iteration of kind of the same thing.
Hmm. Hmm. And what kind of work do you do day to day? Like, do you like what percentage coding versus like leadership? I think you're a director, engineering director, or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. So I spend, with the exception carved out when I intentionally carve it out. I spend almost no time actually coding myself these days.
Okay.
Um, I do spend a fair amount of time in code review, in architectural reviews, in discovery. Fairly in-depth technical discovery with clients, dealing with
Hmm.
what we're going to build, how we're going to build it, and then reviewing and kind of evaluating the process as it's built out to make sure that we're building to quality.
Hmm.
So I'm involved pretty deep in some of our projects, especially our flagship projects.
Hmm.
But I'm not hands-on coding. And then I'm also part of the leadership team for the company. So there's some
Right.
element of my time that just goes into kind of company management overall.
Company stuff. Do you miss
Yeah.
coding?
Uh, I Yes, to some degree. But I I I I love the solution design part of it, and I still get to do that when I'm working on the architecture.
Right.
So it's not so much that I miss
Not
coding;
too
it's more that
much.
I have to miss I have to hold myself back from it because I know there are things that are higher leverage for me to work on. And
Hmm.
sometimes if I'm like, oh, I could just go in and do this myself right now, that's what I have to resist.
Yeah.
It's not so much missing, but just like, okay, I know this isn't the most important thing for me to work on. Um,
Priorities,
yeah,
prioritizing. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it's development is a weird thing where like so much of the time people that no longer code actively like miss it in this way that I don't know if it's the
hmm
same in like other industries. Like I don't know if people that do construction work when they become construction managers like ever
right,
miss
right.
construction work.
I don't know for sure, but I would imagine something like that would be true though in like other creative fields, which I mean, and that's partially what makes that true about development.
Yeah,
I would imagine the designer who becomes a executive creative director might, maybe, I don't know for sure. I'm not
totally.
one, but
Yeah.
might miss getting in there with Photoshop and actually, putting something out or design out himself or herself.
Yeah, I think so. So when it comes to the various, e-commerce platforms, Magento, Shopify, I don't know exactly which ones you guys work with, BigCommerce.
Those are the two main ones. We work with BigCommerce a little bit as well, but
Okay.
that's a lesser part of our work.
What are some things that you're excited about, enjoying learning, and or like particular pain points with, the different e-com platforms that you're using?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the ones that come to mind are the things that everyone knows to some degree about the platforms, but are just they come up in your face every single day. And for Magento, that would be the great things about it is how it's flexible it is, and the
Hmm.
fantastic user community around it for open source. The downside is just the sheer complexity of it. I've got people on my team who have been working with it for years, and I've been working with it for years. I go back to like very early days of Magento 1 when I first started working on it, and I still find stuff that I'm like, wait, how did I not know this entire time? Like, I feel like no single person has all of Magento in their head.
Yeah.
I mean, there are probably a few of those Magento masters
Couple
out there who
unicorns. Yeah.
right, right. But for the most part, like just the level of complexity there can get in your way on the Magento side. On the Shopify side, you have the opposite problem. It's that the whole walled garden thing, and
Yeah.
you feel like you're twisting the platform to do things that it was never intended to do. So these things that should be relatively straightforward. And we've even had clients who kind of, I mean, it's not exactly fair, but I completely understand where they're coming from. Who kind of get mad at us. They're like, why is this why is this so hard to do this thing? It should be so simple. The whole promise of Shopify is that it's simple. And I'm like, well, it's because your needs are just this much outside of whatever Shopify was designed for. And
Hmm.
now you're twisting this like SaaS platform into this, kind of
Yeah.
a knot to make it work.
Yeah. You're in the danger zone of customizing too much.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
it's interesting. I've been so Magento heavy for so long. I'm kind of starting to like poke my head up and look at some of the different platforms and try to understand them, understand the different strengths and weaknesses, and jump into the different communities as well, and try to
Yeah.
really kind of understand them a little bit. You know.
Yeah. I didn't mention the positive for Shopify, but the positive there, I mean, is again the exact flip side of that is I know theoretically you can set up a Magento store in like an hour or something like that. If you really know what you're doing and don't care to customize anything at all.
Mm,
But in that same hour, you can have a Shopify store up with a custom theme that's been chosen with, at least brand colors that match what you want. Like you're not nearly that far along on the Magento
mhm,
side. And so if you're talking about a smaller company that just needs to get a scrappy e-commerce presence up there, and maybe even running a decent sized business, but they just need to get up live quickly. You
mhm.
just can't beat a SaaS platform for that.
Yeah, yeah. Have you looked at their subscriptions? Like Shopify launched the new kind of native subscription functionality, and I'd seen you respond to some tweets related to the subscription stuff.
Yeah, I've been eagerly awaiting that because every time that we have a client that comes on board uh, who needs subscriptions, um, I'm like, do we tell them to hold out just a little bit longer for this golden day of native Magento or not Magento Shopify subscriptions, and we really have up till now always pushed everyone toward. We experimented with a few options. Recurly was the one that we kind of not Recurly. We've used that outside of Shopify. Recharge is the one that we've
Recharge.
really
That's the
kind of
big one.
ended up
I see
pushing
a
clients towards
lot
a
of
lot.
people running into issues with recharge, and like I see a lot of people post on that about Twitter. Like,
Recharge has challenges. Without naming names, we've used some of their competitors, and they're worse. So
okay,
you know, so
yeah,
it's like the thing is, before I first worked with subscriptions for the first time, I'm like, oh, how hard can it be? You just charge somebody every month. Like uh, I really don't know how to explain to someone who hasn't literally written subscription code how complex and thorny this gets. Like it doesn't seem like it should be that bad, but
yeah.
it is a naughty problem when you get into all the nuances and edge cases of pausing and rescheduling and fixing the recharge or renewal dates like that's a common day of the month, like all the
Manual
individual things.
overrides and all sorts of
Right,
stuff. Yeah,
right. Changes in payment methods and dunning to update your credit card information when their number
right,
changes, and
right.
it's like
It's
a Shrek.
gnarly.
There's like layers, layers, and layers.
Yeah. Yeah, and it seems like there's still, some issues with I haven't worked with it too closely, but, it seems like there's issues with migrating, into the new,
Yeah, and
native
so that's
functionality and
yeah. I kind of dropped the lead earlier, but yeah, that's the you know a lot of our clients aren't ready to move to that new platform until it's more clearly tested and ready to go. I think if we did have new clients who were just launching a store, I think we would definitely go with the subscription. Uh, well, actually, you really have no choice now because when all their partners that ran subscriptions through the that were on the App Store launch as kind of the simultaneous launch. All of their old versions of their apps just dropped off the App Store simultaneously. So actually, you have no choice but to use the new model going forward.
right, right.
Um, but but I think that's a good thing. It's definitely better to build on that in the future.
Yeah. So most of your current, clients that are doing subscription stuff are on Recharge. Do you have
Mhm.
any that are on, and are most of them on Shopify or any that are on Magento as well?
So we do have actually one of our biggest subscription clients is on Magento, and we actually use we don't use a SaaS or like an external like service there. We actually use the Paradox Lab subscription module, which is
Right,
fantastic. So
right.
if you're going to run subscriptions on Magento, I highly recommend that module. It's not a cheap module, but it's totally pays for itself off. I don't work for Paradox Labs, but this is my little free advert for them here.
Nice.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, they did
Now that you
a really
mention
good
it
job with that.
now that you mention it, I think I remember seeing you guys tweeting about that at one point.
Mhm.
So is that one a lot better than like Recharge, for different things that you'd need to do?
So I mean, it's hard to say because they're so different. I mean, one is a module that fits right into Magento, and so there's definitely advantages to that. You can customize and extend the behavior however you want, and that was really important for this one client of ours. They actually considered going on Shopify when they've been on Magento one. And a number of years ago now, we took over their site and they replatformed them onto Magento 2, and we considered Shopify for them at that point. But they do a lot of really nuanced stuff with their subscriptions, and they want to really fine tune how it works in a
Mhm.
way that would have been a nightmare to do on any. I mean, even with the new subscriptions platform. Like you want to have fine grained control over exactly how it's working. And so
Hmm.
that's where Magento with the Paradox Labs module is great, because we can extend and override that behavior however we
Hmm.
need. At the same time, there's an advantage of just having a SaaS tool that just does it if you don't
Hmm.
need that.
Yeah. What are some of those things that they're doing to really get in there and override and do some unique things with subscriptions? To the extent that you can share
Yeah,
any of that.
yeah. So I'm trying to think of a good example. Well, so one option is, and this has improved over time with the SaaS platforms, though it's still not fantastic. And they've actually changed this, but actually, I mean, I can say the client's Munchpack. They've they're on, we have no NDAs, but saying to our client, but they used to offer a preferences option where, and it's a snack pack, like you get like a box of like snacks delivered with snacks from all around the world.
Mhm.
And they used to offer a preferences
Sounds
option where you
great.
could, yeah, you should, yeah, go buy Munchpack.
I should
Um,
go check that out.
um, but they used to have a preferences option where you could say, I want salty snacks, and I don't want fish flavored snacks, which, I mean, in other parts of the world, that seems like weird, like for an American palate, but there are fish flavored, like chips, for example, they're sold. But like you
That's
can say,
wild.
I don't want this, or I do want this. And being able to keep track of that kind of custom options on the subscriptions in the past, when we were first launching this, was kind of a weak point for a lot of those out of the box or like Shopify app based subscriptions.
Mm,
Even now, it would be a little bit trickier for us to include that than it was on Magento.
gotcha. So having stuff like product option, like options on the product kind of
Yeah,
object.
yeah. You can do that, but I mean, really, that's almost a Shopify limitation intrinsically. You can do custom options on products, but it's all really buried under the hood, and
Mm,
so there's not a lot of first class support for that. Where it's just standard with Magento.
hmm. Hmm. So this is kind of a random question that came up on Twitter that I want to like just bounce around was this
Hmm.
microservices SaaS thing where like a buddy of mine was asking like an e-commerce store that has a bunch of SaaS plugins, right? Like we're talking about subscriptions, you can think of
Hmm.
reviews, you can think of 100 other types of plugins. And
Right.
the question is like, is that a microservices architecture? Which I think the definition of microservices is that they're highly maintainable, testable, loosely coupled, independently deployable, organized around business capabilities, and owned by a small team. So I
Hmm.
want to I want to bounce this around with you. I'm curious what you think about it. I think on Twitter you said that it was a hybrid architecture.
Right. Right.
Um,
And someone, and I forget who it was, replied back and followed up and said, well, the term for that is hub and spoke. And actually, when I first wrote my
right.
tweet, I was thinking of saying, oh, it's a hub and spoke. But then I had like, Googled myself, and I only came up because I was like second guessing, is that the right term? And I only came up with like other usages of it. So now, like, oh, I'm not going to say that. I'm just going to say it's hybrid.
Yeah,
But
I
I mean,
think that was
I think
David Alger.
that sounds right. Yeah. I think the hub and spoke model. I mean, that is conceptually, what it is. You can still have that central monolith that's in the middle there,
Mhm,
but you've moved out some of the core features to an external service.
mhm,
I think to the degree, uh, if it breaks down as considering the microservices, it's to the degree that they're actually micro, because a lot of those external services are pretty macro in terms of
mhm,
the functionality that they have within them.
mhm,
But at least you've kind of moved paradigmatically in that direction.
mhm. Yeah, so the hub and spoke, so basically like a true microservice. Like I'm trying to think of a canonical example of microservices, and I keep thinking of Twitter, although I don't know if that's exactly a microservices, but I think of like the search service and the messaging service. I assume
Right.
that's a microservices architecture, but that's the example I
Yeah.
keep
I'm
kind
not
of
sure what their internal architecture is. I know one in the e-commerce world, one company
right.
that went crazy. I mean, and I'm just maybe in a negative sense, but they went like full bore in the microservice direction was Jet.com.
Okay,
I actually had attended a talk with one of their engineers, just like a
perfect.
local meetup.
Okay.
And I mean, they carved everything into really small microservices, and I couldn't name all the details there, but like I think they had like a pricing microservice or even multiple pricing microservices depending on like what the individual
Wow,
need was there,
gotcha.
and then you had an inventory microservice, and I mean in some degree that's kind of what you see Magento going toward with all of its different carving up of modules. But they had done that on a completely their own custom platform. It wasn't
Hmm.
it wasn't
Hmm.
on
Right.
something
Right.
official or
Right.
external.
Right. And like I think like search, for example, is probably a good example of a microservice,
Hmm.
one of the pieces of functionality. And like that could be pretty big. That could be a big like feature in the sense of it could be a lot of code behind that, right? You could have a
Hmm.
lot of data. You could probably even have a decent sized team behind that.
Right.
So like like is it micro or not? Like you could say search
Hmm.
is like that's not very micro. Like that's like that's a decent size feature.
Right.
But I feel like that would still fit into a microservices kind of a model.
Yeah.
And then
I
like
think I think to me, I mean, there is certainly a degree to which the volume of code is relevant for whether it's a microservice, but I think a lot of that is almost, to borrow kind of the object-oriented like a principle, like a single responsibility principle,
mhm,
where
mhm,
uh, is this one thing, or like to borrow from like a domain-driven design model, where like is this like one action or one domain object that you're kind
mhm,
of interacting with there, or is it mixing a whole bunch of different things together?
mhm, mhm,
And so if you think of, like, say, to take subscriptions, if you take something like recharge, and in your model you're thinking of recharge is the microservice. Well,
mhm.
recharge is doing a whole bunch of things.
It's
They've got
doing
the
a lot of
subscriptions
stuff.
and the customers and accounts and orders and
Right.
invoices, and so
Right.
that's, maybe each of those individual things are microservices in the sense,
Mhm.
but uh, I probably would be not great to call recur or recharge as a whole
Mhm.
a microservice.
A microservice. But then like if you had the like in the jet example,
Hmm.
um I mean, I could imagine like your subscription, functionality could be a so if the subscription functionality wasn't the microservice, let's say in the jet.com example, theoretical example,
Hmm.
how would
Right.
it break like how would it be broken down into component parts that were more microservicey than the
Hmm.
subscriptions as a whole?
Well, I mean, you could, for example, have like your literal core subscription microservice that isn't responsible for keeping track of promos or keeping track of accounts, but literally
Right.
is responsible for handling the reorders. On
Just the subscription logic.
on this date, it's the due for the next renewal of the subscription. I'm going to go ahead and place that order.
Right. Right.
And I mean, if that's a service, I don't, or is that a background job? But but like that kind of a carving off of a small piece of functionality, I would say that's where you'd want to keep a microservice to like that level of scope.
Right. Right. Yeah, I don't know. It's just it was a random thing that it's stuck in my head, and I
Yeah.
don't know why I keep thinking about it. I'm not
Mhm.
like
Right.
I'm not a
Well, it's
huge
the kind of thing that
technical.
developers love to debate because it's semantics. I mean, like
Right, exactly.
you what is a microservice? Well, anything larger than a macro service. I mean, you mean in a sense, but but but
Right.
is it, what's is it what the intent of microservices was? Well, you can almost look at like a spectrum. You're moving that direction, but you're probably not all the
Yeah,
way to a
yeah.
proper microservice.
It's funny because I think what stuck out to me about it was that like I heard a lot of talk around microservices, kind of in the same way we heard about headless. It's like there's a lot of excitement around it, maybe from a developer perspective, but then fast
Hmm.
forward a few years and you go like, oh, nobody's really doing this except for like rare cases of like
Hmm.
companies. And then I go, wait a minute, everybody's doing this. Like everybody
Hmm.
that is following this kind of e-commerce platform and SaaS plugins is actually doing this thing that I thought was going to happen, but then didn't really happen. But then, oh wow, it is happening.
Yeah.
I think that was why I kind of like, it stuck out
And I
to me.
think even outside of like that SaaS model where you have those, hub and big spokes, worth like six third parties, I think that is the approach that you're seeing a lot more of, even for boutique and in-house software, is something of a monolith that's still there, but then microservices that get carved off because that particular piece makes sense to maintain separately.
Mhm.
We need to scale it independently, or it's a very domain bounded context that we can say, oh, we're going to have a team that's specific to this who works on this piece, and
Mhm.
have a clear API that talks to it.
Right.
But yeah, there
Right.
was definitely a microservices craze where it was like microservice all the things, and that's probably was overkill.
Yeah. And then the other thing I'm trying to think about is like, are those SaaS services loosely coupled or not?
Mhm,
Um, it's another kind of a semantics thing, I think, a little bit. What exactly does loosely coupled mean? Like, in theory, could you replace it on the fly with nothing at all breaking? No, probably not. Although in certain instances you can, certain like interfaces for certain types of things are pluggable. Um,
mhm,
but like in reality, even if like jet.com had a microservice change, like most likely things would break if something got swapped out with their one of their pricing microservices, like I'd
mhm.
imagine. So that's another thing I'm trying to think through whether or not you would consider them loosely coupled or not, you know.
So I mean, like if you think about it in like a PHP sense, loosely coupling depends a lot on. I mean, you can do it without this, but it's greatly helped by using something like an interface that defines what that standard communication is. It's like
Mhm.
the API for that class.
Mhm.
So to some degree, if you could have in the SaaS equivalent of an interface that defines like how you communicate between two different pieces of SaaS software,
Mhm.
then those could be loosely coupled from each other. The problem is that doesn't typically exist unless you're using like a true middleware solution.
Mhm. Mhm.
So then uh, you do end up with tight coupling because you're having to call the other API, the other SaaS service with the idiosyncrasies of their particular implementation, but
Mhm.
no, without that interface that says, okay, this is the standard that we're all going to abide by.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
haven't dug into like the new Shopify subscriptions far enough to know 100% for sure how it works. But from what I have read, I think to some degree that is part of what it's doing. I mean, part of it is Shopify is just taking over part of the functionality, but part of it is they are providing this standard interface that says, okay, you want to talk to a subscription platform. Here's what the interface looks like, and whether that platform is us on our own or us plus Recharge or us plus Bold, you
Mhm.
have that kind of interface that allows you to decouple your logic a little bit from those third
Right.
parties.
Right. 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 What are some of your favorite like architectural challenges when it comes to e-commerce just generally? Like what kinds of problems are the most fun for you to try to solve?
Yeah, I think that whenever you're well, fun, you can take fun in two ways, like literal fun or literal like oh that's fun. I'd say actually the oh that's fun is the easier one to answer,
Okay, let's
and
go
that's
that direction.
and that's when you have to deal with like a data map between two different systems that like handle things under like different paradigms. Like we had
Right.
to integrate with one ERP where like what they called an invoice was what Magento called an order,
Hmm.
and they didn't have like or like what they called an invoice was basically what Magento called an order plus an invoice. But like even then, it
Right.
wasn't like it's not like a 1-to-1 mapping or not even a 1-to-2 mapping. It's like this is oriented this way and this is oriented this way. They're like perpendicular to each other, and you're trying to
Hmm.
map it back and forth.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a challenge. And so it's like it's fun in that in a sincere sense. It's fun to have that challenge, but it's also like tearing your hair out at the same time because you're trying to figure out how to get these systems to cooperate in a consistent, clear way.
Right. Right. Right.
But
When
yeah.
circling back a little bit to we talked about kind of going remote and the team, your team and stuff like that. When it comes to hiring, I'm trying to do a better
Mhm.
job of talking about hiring on this podcast. um, what are some of the biggest challenges that you're facing, or on the flip side, things that are working particularly well as far as hiring goes for you guys?
Yeah. So I we haven't made our first remote hire yet since we've gone remote, but we are in an interview process right now for several. Well, actually, I should say in engineering, we've actually hired a couple of roles outside of engineering remote. We have a business development representative and account manager who are now like outside of our area, and so we've had to go through that whole process fully remote. But engineering wise, we're in the interview process right now for a couple positions, but haven't actually made a hire yet.
Hmm.
um, I think that so far it hasn't made a huge difference just with our process because we always had a very streamlined process in the first place that was like an initial phone screen followed by an in-person interview that was with a couple people on the team, and kind of talk through software architecture principles and a little bit of like tech stuff, or tech language features, that kind of thing. um,
Yeah.
and we've mostly just moved that online. And since we haven't made a hire yet, it's hard to say exactly whether or not we'll look back on it and say, oh, we should have done something differently. But so
Mhm,
far in the hiring process, I haven't found that being over a video screen has made a whole lot of difference than being in person for that.
mhm, mhm.
Um,
I
but
saw
yeah.
somebody the other day that's starting to do like asynchronous video interviews,
Mm, mm,
where there's like a platform that just lets people record a video, I guess, response to standard questions.
yeah.
I just saw that a couple days ago, and I thought that was a really cool
Mhm.
way to kind of streamline things. You know.
Yeah. I would say one thing that, going remote has made us, it hasn't changed our process, but it's changed us what we look for in a candidate, in the sense that, communication is always core. I mean, it's so core that I think it's kind of silly when people list that as like a trait on like a job listing, like, oh, you would want someone who doesn't communicate? Like, of course. But I do think that communication skills are all the more important in a remote position.
Yeah.
And so we have, uh, you know, I haven't gone this far yet, but even something like a writing sample is something that I've considered putting in
Mm,
place that in the past wasn't as critical, because if someone wrote something out that wasn't as clear, we can go talk to them, just clarify what they mean.
mm,
But with things needing to be more asynchronous, actually having a writing sample, I think is something that we may put into our process, so it's clear. And
yeah.
I've begun to take that a little more informally, even when I'm looking at like resumes and cover letters. Um, I've I've never been the sort, and I'm still not the sort to like throw someone's application out because they had like one typo. But whereas I might have had a little more grace with like someone just being a little bit unclear. Now I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
if you're not clear in terms of what you're
Right.
saying in your application, that's a bad sign for what you're going to be like when you're rushed and in a hurry later on.
Yeah, yeah. I'm similar. Like I don't. There's only a couple typos that are like a deal, but for some reason, lowercase I in the
Oh
beginning of a
yeah,
sentence, just
right,
I can't do
yeah,
it. But other than that, like I'm not real picky on typos. But yeah, like
hmm,
is the clarity there. Um, for the writing sample thing, as you're thinking through that, like what type of a writing prompt are you leaning towards? Like, is it
hmm,
maybe here's a bug report, and how are they going to
right.
combination of sort of troubleshoot it, communicate around it, or maybe like a feature, some communication around a new feature. What are you thinking
Yeah.
there?
So one of the things that I've kind of tossing around in my head, and it's probably the direction I'd move forward here, is, um, and this combines it with another benefit, is having kind of a standard feature, and essentially having them do a code review of that.
Mm,
But doing it in a written format, in GitHub or Bitbucket, make that really easy.
mm,
But so, but I would probably kind of phrase it like, imagine this is a pull request being put in by a junior, we call them associate developer on the team. And
mm,
so it's more than just point out the issue, but kind of explain why that needs to be
mm,
changed.
mhm,
Because then we're
mhm,
both assessing, okay, how do you evaluate code? How do you recognize where there are things that need to be changed,
mhm,
which is, of course, a valuable thing. But then at the same time, also, we can see how they communicate, how well do they explain themselves.
mhm. That's a good idea. Like communicate it and maybe try to, like sort of maybe that educating the team member kind of
Right,
collaboratively, maybe
right.
not just like here are the things that are wrong, but like communicating
Hmm.
in a way that's helpful,
Yeah.
right?
Right. And I mean, I
Yeah.
think that's good for code review in general, but I would probably give that additional prompt that, like, keep in mind this is, or think of this as being submitted by someone who
Mhm,
is not just a peer at your same level of seniority, and you're just like, oh, did you catch this thing? Like, oh, okay, got it.
mhm.
Like they may not get what you're saying, so kind of walk them through it a little bit more.
I like that. That's a good idea. So there's a nonprofit that you volunteer for, Redemption Housing,
Hmm.
which integrates the formerly incarcerated back into the life of their community, which I think is really cool that you do that. And I think I've seen you tweet about that a little bit.
Hmm.
How's all that going, and what do you do for that? What do you do to volunteer there?
Yeah, so my primary involvement there these days is I just serve on the board. I used to be involved a little bit more hands-on. I was one of the founding board members of the organization back when it first got started, and at that
Mm,
point, it was like all hands on deck to get everything done. And we're still a small organization, so that's still true to some degree. But these
mm,
days, I used to live in Philly, and it's an organization based in Philly.
mm,
So my personal involvement is more maintaining the website and being involved on the board. But the organization is doing great. We have one house up right now where we have several men who are uh, actually just about to transition out of our program and have been, we're nearing the end of fundraising for opening our second house
Mhm.
so that we can open that up. And this first house that we have right now is for people who have already been out of prison for a little while and have gotten their feet under them a little bit, but
Mhm.
still need just a little bit. We call it kind of like the next step program, a little bit more support before they're ready to go out on their own.
Mhm.
But our next house is really what our vision is for to begin with, and that is for those who are coming directly out of prison, and to give them a place where they can live with community support, but in a dignified manner. And I think that's a big piece of it because frankly, there's just not enough programs out there that provide housing for or supports in general for people coming out of incarceration. But
Mhm.
those that do are often strip some of the dignity away from the individuals, and we
Mhm.
want to really keep that in place for
Mhm.
them.
Like some of the typical like halfway houses, you mean? Like
Yeah.
they're
So I mean, yeah, like a lot of halfway houses. There's if you talk to guys who've men or women who've been through those, it will either go one or two directions. Either they're so permissive and anything goes that there's no structure at all for someone um, who may benefit from a little bit of structure and a little bit of support for
Mhm.
getting integrated back into the community, and
Mhm.
lead to very rapid recidivism because there's just nothing to help support them at all. Or they go to the level where it's basically like being in prison all over again with just like a little bit more
Mhm.
freedom.
Mhm.
And we want to, and it's I'm not sure that I can promise we'll always be perfect at it, but our goal is to really walk the line between those two approaches where you have that dignity of feeling you are a free person. You're not still back in prison,
Mhm.
but giving them the holistic support, wraparound services that they need
Mhm.
to do well, and to get from as our director likes to say it, going from mass incarceration to mass reintegration back into the communities and neighborhoods.
That's awesome, man. How did you get involved with that? Like what was the impetus for you initially?
Yeah, so I had kind of I have an interesting background from my development and professional career has kind of been in parallel with a nonprofit and career. I actually graduated from seminary as well,
I saw
and
that. Yeah, MDiv.
um, yeah, and while I was working on my degree, I was an intern at a church, and one of the fellow interns uh, had this idea for redemption housing back while we were there, but he wasn't ready to get it started. We both graduated, moved on. He was then working for the city of Philadelphia, or actually no, not yet at that point. He was working for like a rescue mission, like homeless shelter. Um, um, but that was just general. It wasn't specifically to the for the formerly incarcerated in any sense. But reached back out and said, hey, I'd like to get this thing started that we talked about back, years ago.
Mhm.
And said, yeah, I'm on board. So we and a few others, kind of got it off the ground in the first place. And
Mhm.
it's I wouldn't say it's been rapid growth, but it's been growing, and it's a steady, healthy organization. So excited about that.
It's really cool, man. It's a really neat thing to do. There's a lot in the
Yeah,
news, related to incarceration and especially like for low level drug
right.
offenses and stuff like that. And
Yeah,
I mean, you're actually working at it on the ground, which is amazing.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and actually,
so
that overall attention in the media has actually helped. Like we were very grateful to our donors there because we actually have had one of our best financial years this year in the midst
nice,
of COVID. Um, because I think partially because of a lot of the attention that's been in the media, that's been helpful
right,
to the real
right.
issues that are out there. But has given us a big boost toward that fundraising for the second house.
That's amazing, man. And I'd imagine most charity contributions have got to be down during COVID.
Overall,
I mean,
absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So we're kind of one of the exceptions there.
That's great, man. That's really cool that you do that. Awesome, man. Well, it was a lot of fun getting a chance to chat with you. Where is the best place for people to find you online?
So me personally, Twitter is my primary place of engagement there. So I'm the Scottish B, which sounds like super pompous, but it was literally all the other variations of my name were taken by the time I got on Twitter. So
It's hard. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to find a handle these days.